Good afternoon, everyone. On behalf of India International Center, CUTS International and Institute of Chinese Studies, I would like to extend a very warm welcome to all of you to this seminar on the very important subject of China and the multilateral trading system. Before I proceed further, let me welcome three very distinguished panelists we have with us today. And when I say distinguished, it's not just figure of speech. Actually, we do have people who have specialized in this subject. Dr. Mohan Kumar, who was our ambassador in France until very recently, and is now Vice Dean and Professor of Diplomatic Practice of Jindal School of International Relations, as also Executive Director of the Center of WTO Studies and Economic Diplomacy in Jindal Global University, has a long association with what was then called GATT and then WTO. He has been India's lead negotiator in important areas like IPRs, services, dispute settlement, rules and technical barriers to trade. So Mohan, welcome to this seminar. Dr. Harsha Singh. Harsha is Executive Director of Brookings India and Senior Fellow of Council of Emerging Market Enterprises at Fletcher School. Now Harsh, once again, he was actually Deputy Director General at WTO for 8 years until September 2013. And he has researched and worked both as a scholar and practitioner extensively on WTO related issues. Thank you very much, Harsh, for joining this discussion. Dr. Bipul Chatterjee is the Executive Director of CUTS International, which, as you know, is a leading NGO based out of Jaipur. Bipul also has done extensive work on political economy of trade and development, including multilateral trading system. And I would like to especially thank Bipul for coming up with this idea of doing this joint event together with IIC and ICS. Thank you, Bipul. As you are aware, China joined WTO in December 2001. It was truly a seminal event in development of both the global economy and multilateral trading system in recent past. As you're aware, China has integrated strongly, extensively, deeply with the global trading system. It's now the leading trading nation in the world, and it has benefited immensely from its accession to WTO. Since then, it has also become a leading player, a very influential actor in multilateral trading system. And the objective of the seminar today will be to explore various issues relating to China's role in multilateral trading negotiations. Bipul has very thoughtfully identified some key discussion points, including growth of China's trade and investment policies and the implications, state of play at the WTO on major existing and emerging issues, China's increasing contribution in shaping of future global trade order, and implications for Chinese role for India. And here we can also explore, what kind of convergence we have between negotiating positions of India and China on important multilateral trade issues. We cannot discuss China today without touching upon Xi Jinping's great initiative on Belt and Road. So we'll also see how BRI, Belt and Road Initiative, impacts on future global trade order in general and connectivity in particular. And finally, though this issue is not listed out here, we can perhaps also look at the issue of market economic status for China. As you know, in Section 15 of China's accession agreement for WTO, 15D, there is this provision of transition. China is arguing that it should have been automatic. Others question that there are important implications for India, and this is one issue perhaps we can go into. With this background, let me begin by inviting Ambassador Mohan Kumar to make his presentation. Harsha has said that he would like to speak after that, after Mohan, and then we go to Bipul. I'll request panelists to spend something like 10-12 minutes each so that we have enough time for discussion, but it's up to them how long they wish to take. Thank you. Mohan.
Thank you very much, Ashok. It's a pleasure to be here in the middle of at least some recognizable friendly faces, but others whom I don't know. But it's always happy to come back to one's own country after spending a decade abroad. I will leave some of the nuts and bolts to Harsha. I think he spent a longer time at the WTO after I left. My departure from Geneva at the WTO coincided with China entering the multilateral trading system. I left soon after the Doha round was launched. So I would like to spend some time talking about China's accession and then talk about what China did post-Doha, and then spend a little bit of time about what Ashok refers to as an assessment of what the future has in store for India-China collaboration and multilateral trading system. When China joined the WTO, I think Ashok is absolutely correct. For a change, the word seminal is not an exaggeration. Some went as far as to say that it is not China joining WTO, but it is WTO joining China. So it was considered an extremely momentous event for two simple reasons. One, the size of the Chinese economy. But for those of us who spent time at the WTO, the second more important characteristic of China's accession was the weight of state-owned enterprises at the time when China acceded to the WTO. That resulted in the accession negotiations being arguably much more complicated than any other, definitely much longer than any other. And I would also say, if you make an objective assessment of the result of China's accession at the WTO, it resulted in China getting rights which were WTO less as opposed to other members. And in terms of obligations, it was WTO plus for China. So if you actually looked at it, it was 15 years, and it was not just the length. I would also say that China was, I think, subjected to a lot of pressure, and some would describe the outcome as a little bit unfair, in the sense that other countries, there was no other country like China. So you could say in that sense China was sui generis, but nevertheless the outcome was not fully fair to China. That is something that we will have to accept. The other new element in China's accession was when a country normally accedes to the WTO, you accede by undertaking obligations, by granting concessions, and finally you then say that you will bring yourself into conformity with WTO law with a transition period or without a transition period. In China's case, the accession instrument itself became judiciable, and in fact is currently judiciable. We can spend a little bit of time talking about the famous market economy status for China, which according to the accession document and which according to China's interpretation should have happened in December 2016 quite automatically. But other trading powers in the WTO think that it is not automatic. And it's quite interesting for me as an outsider now to note that India actually agrees with US and EU that China should not be granted market economy status. That is a big first for India. If those of us who have spent time in the WTO, we have automatically sometimes supported developing countries in the past, even at our cost. So it's quite unusual for India now to say that no, we do not think, and then for very good reasons. The reasons are well known to everybody. So I think I will go back to the point I made, which is the weight of state-owned enterprises, because it is directly relevant to the market economy status. And it is the view of several countries that the weight of state-owned enterprises has not decreased. And if you accept that argument, that state-owned enterprises still play a primordial, predominant role in the Chinese economy, then obviously, countries are reluctant to grant the market economy status. And even Australia, which granted the market economy status to China as far back as 2005, they treat China differently when they impose anti-dumping duties. So as far as the accession is concerned, my assessment is, and the first segment of my intervention, I think it was unique. It could arguably be considered definitely long and arguably unfair to China. And China accepted those onerous conditions because I think they made a calculation that it was in their strategic interest to do so. What is the strategic interest? They thought, first, you can't afford to be outside of the system. Secondly, they thought they will use this to carry out the much needed reforms that was necessary for the Chinese economy. Whether that has happened that way or turned out to be that way is something that is, arguable. But I think this was the logic when China accepted onerous conditions. The current debate on the market economy status illustrates the political complexity. WTO is often serves as an excellent example of an intersection between politics and trade. No decision in WTO is purely trade. It's always political. And in China's case, it has become, I think, much more political than any other case, which probably explains why it is so difficult to settle this market economy status. I suspect two things are putting the dispute settlement mechanism in the WTO under tremendous strain. One of it is China seeking consultations with US, EU on this very matter, the market economy status issue, because it's difficult and hard for me to see how the panel and the appellate body will decide in this case. And whichever way you decide, you're damned if you do, you're damned if you don't. It's going to be a difficult one. Also, this issue that most of you are aware about, how the Americans are going about vis-a-vis the appellate body. So both these things, in my view, are putting tremendous stress on what is considered the jewel in the crown, which is the dispute settlement mechanism. And many people feel the WTO, the only thing that is working is the dispute settlement mechanism, frankly, because after Doha round, nothing much has happened. So I think that is something worth looking out for. How this dispute that China has initiated in the WTO plays out in the next few weeks. The second segment that I wanted to talk briefly about is how China has behaved in the WTO post-Doha. The starting point would have to be a realization by China, and perhaps even an acknowledgement by others, that China did undertake onerous obligations to get into the WTO. If you accept that, then it was logical for China not to immediately say, we are ready to negotiate Doha round and we are ready to undertake huge obligations, because they've already just finished undertaking huge obligations by getting into the WTO. So while I was even leaving Geneva, it was obvious to me that the Chinese, I literally left just after they joined, but in the few meetings they attended, they were basically had a listening brief. They were not being very active at all at that time. So it was obvious to me that that was both a strategic decision, but also it was practical, because having undertaken onerous obligations, you can't then get into a new round and say that I am willing to undertake more obligations just to get the Doha round going. They had no interest in doing that. With the result, one assessment, and I'm not saying it is the assessment, but one assessment is that China has carefully avoided assuming leadership roles in the WTO and has also avoided being the troublemaker. They have played this balancing game. I certainly don't think China has assumed a leadership role among developing countries and so on. That is my assessment. But I think they've also been careful to say that, they don't want to be. For example, in 2008, when there was a collapse of the famous Geneva deal on agriculture, there were reports that it was actually both China and India which were actually responsible in one way. I think our positions were absolutely correct, and I would blame the US, but the Western media painted China and India as the culprits. But gradually, if you see, the general view from outside is that it was actually US-India. So China very cleverly, I think, to some extent, gave the leadership, or not gave, let India, Brazil assume the leadership role among developing countries. So that is what China did, in my view. Now for the last segment, which is what happens now. I think if you look at WTO and what is happening, you have to look at the plurilateral negotiations happening in WTO, because that's the name of the game, frankly. There is not much else happening. So if you look at the Information Technology Agreement 2, if you look at the Trade and Services Agreement, the TISA, the so-called TISA, and the Environmental Goods Agreement, it's very interesting to contrast India's position and China's position. India has just stayed away from the ITA 2. China actually has played hardball. It has negotiated, and at least by some accounts, they quite stood their ground, and they participated in ITA 2, made sure their sensitive subjects were excluded from obligations, and they finally were part of ITA 2. So China has been participating in some of the plurilateral negotiations. In the case of TISA services, it's very interesting. China wants to be part of it. The US doesn't want China to be part of it. But still, the Chinese position, a bit unlike the Indian position, is that if that is the name of the game, we would like to be there. We will participate. And I'm not arguing one way or the other, and obviously there is no comparison between the Chinese economy and the Indian economy, very different. And I'm trying to respond to Ashok's question about how there can be Chinese-Indian cooperation. I think there needs to be a very frank assessment of the tremendous difference, asymmetry in the economies of the two countries. And I don't think China is guided by this leadership position in the developing countries, that we should, get all the developing countries together and assume leadership role. That is simply, in my view, not the way Chinese are looking at it. I think they will go by bilateral deals. In fact, in the ITA 2, they did do a deal with US just before the ITA 2 was finalized, which kind of gives me the impression that the Chinese, even if they are going to be part of a plurilateral agreement, they will do bilateral deals at the right time when it suits them. They did that in the Paris environmental negotiation as well. It's not part of trade, but still, that is just their way of approaching the plurilateral negotiations. I will conclude by just saying something, Ashok, if you don't mind, on the Belt and Road Initiative, and then allow others to say their piece. On the Belt Road Initiative, I think it's important to recognize that in the multilateral trading system, you have a software, the software of the multilateral trading system, which the WTO deals with, which is the rules, the regulations, the barriers, the non-tariff barriers, and so on. The hardware of roads and ports and airports and so on is not dealt with by the WTO. So strictly speaking, the Belt Road Initiative will obviously impact on the volume of trade and on the way trade is done in the world, if it succeeds. But I do not believe WTO has a direct interest. In the meeting that Roberto Azevedo attended as DG WTO, the only thing I could find was that he made some polite noise about how aid for trade of the WTO could be, made available for this Belt Road Initiative, which is kind of absurd, because Belt Road Initiative, we are talking billions and billions, and I don't think the WTO has that kind of money. But the WTO will be faced with a fait accompli. I don't think they will have to welcome it, because it will lead to, presumably, increased volume of trade. It will lead to a whole lot of other problems which members of the Belt Road Initiative are gradually coming to grip with. But I don't believe, therefore, that the multilateral trading system as embodied by the WTO will have much to say on BRI. But obviously BRI will, if it succeeds, result in a game changer in terms of how you define the global supply chain. That I expect for it to change quite dramatically if the BRI takes off and it is successful. The last strategic point I will make with regard to China and the multilateral trading system is that if you compare the way they are going about in terms of political and strategic relations and then trade, in the trade scenario, I think in the political sphere, it's clear to everyone that China has shed its reticence. This whole concept of biding your time and hiding your smile is over. I mean, we have enough cases in terms of China's neighbors to kind of support this contention that I don't believe China is hiding anymore or biting anymore. They're actually flexing their muscles. I believe, and I say this under correction, I believe that in the trading system, they're still biting and hiding. I do not believe they've started flexing their muscles. Whether they will or not, I do not know. But I therefore see a slight disconnect between their politics and economics, which is very natural, I think, because China is not there yet. They still have serious issues of disparity and internal issues. So until that happens, what you will see in China, in case of China's attitude towards the multilateral trading system, will be one of brutal self-interest. It will be one of great pragmatism, and it will be one of doing deals depending on the issue. I just learned that China and India have submitted a joint proposal on agriculture in terms of eliminating export subsidies. So that's fine. So they will sleep with India when it suits them. They will sleep with US in ITA too, and they may decide to do that with Australia, EU when it comes to the environmental goods agreement. So it will be really cherry picking and making sure their interests are protected. So once again, Ashok, it's a great pleasure and honor to participate, and I look forward to some interaction. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mohan. Mohan has made a number of very important points. One that how China's accession to WTO was sui generis, given size and background and endowments and potential of the country. China did take on obligations which were very seen to be onerous, but surprisingly, it has not been something regretted back home because it was done very deliberately. As Mohan said, out of strategic considerations and also as a driver of growth, a driver of reforms within the Chinese system. Mohan also made this important point that post accession to WTO, how China has been reluctant to take on additional obligations in Doha round. In response to a query I had raised about possibility of convergence between India and China in multilateral trading negotiations, Mohan has pointed out how economies of India and China are asymmetrical, similar, and Chinese proclivity for bilateral deals, which will come in the way of reaching areas of convergence, except when China wishes to make bilateral deals with us. Thank you, Mohan, for these and many other important points that you have made. Now I'll request Harsha to make his presentation.
Thank you very much, Mohan. Thank you for a very insightful set of points. I agree with most of them. I will expand upon some of them. And when I think about China, a story comes to my mind. In the late 1990s, I'd left WTO in June 97, so it's before that. The EU was negotiating with the Chinese chief negotiator, the chief negotiator of EU on accession. And he said, why do you want this flexibility? Why do you want that flexibility? And on the ground, you're a developing country. You're number 6 in the world in this. You're number 5 in the world in this. You're number 7 in this. And the Chinese chief negotiator said, stop. I know you and US have decided not to give me accession this year. I will be number 1, not 5, 6, 7, number 1. And I will say jump, and you will only ask how high. This is in the late 1990s. I think China has covered that distance halfway. Because China, I feel that China has actually changed the way a lot of interaction and definitions are conventionally seen. Mohan said that it's not accepting a leadership role. In my understanding, China actually does not act in a leadership role the way India tries to do that. Because India tries to build coalitions and then is a leading force with certain ideas to take them forward. China actually tries not just to build coalitions, because that effort requires just duplication. It lets India do that job. It comes out with proposals and ideas which actually are substantively in favor of developing nations and LDCs, without necessarily saying that I will want the same kind of flexibilities. In climate change, it came out the same way. It was one of the first to come out with 97% duty-free, quota-free. So a number of steps it takes as a leader while maintaining it's a developing economy. So its leadership role is actually executed in a different manner altogether, not in the conventional manner of coalition building. And WTO, and Mohan rightly said that it's economics and politics, but because there is economics, people focus on dollars and cents, and they focus on issues. And a lot of developing country arguments are based on moral positions that, we cannot assume that much burden, which China also uses. However, China changed its engagement because initially it kept in the background, as Mohan has explained, and the key negotiating group was G4, which was EU, US, Brazil, and India. It came out very openly in May 2008 meetings, which failed. And the reason they failed, actually, the plug was pulled when the USTR was trying to negotiate with China on certain key items, market access on certain key items, and China refused. And that was when, from Washington, DC, the agriculture lobby said, we don't want to engage. And then in market access in goods, US came out with a proposal on what they called sectorals, which is zero tariffs in 2 out of 3 sectors, which they talked about, focus on China and India. That's when China and India joined hands. And that's when they came out together. Before that, India was the shoulder from which China was firing its bullets. But now China came out in front, and then G4 became G5, which then became G7. Japan and Australia also there. So China came out very openly in May 2008 to guard its interests from a defensive perspective. So its engagement changed from being in the background to one actually taking very strong positions. While it was doing that, they very methodically trained their officials in multiple ways. For example, whenever there is a dispute, you have a member who takes a third party interest. So you actually have access to the documents, you can attend meetings, etc. The largest number of third parties in the shortest time period was China. That was one kind of training. And it did this in a very systematic way. So it trained and enabled itself, and when the situation came, it came out. And that is the transition China has made in WTO system throughout, and I'll just explain how. For instance, when trade facilitation agreement was being negotiated, that was the first time China and India, which had joined hands in May 2008, actually were in different camps. China strongly was for trade facilitation agreement and even asked India to support that. Of course, India had its own focus on food stockholding, which incidentally China also supports. But at that point of time, in China's view, for the global trading system, trade facilitation agreement was far more important. And China views the global trading system much more positively than India does. Although the ratio of trade to GDP of India is higher than that of China. So, while on an issue base, and this is a very important insight Mohan talked about, China takes positions now on issue-based perspective. On domestic support, where China has actually come out with India with a proposal, in addition to that, on food stock holding, actually India and China are working together, trying to get agreement from some in the other side who might stand in the way. The other thing is that China is the elephant in the room in most WTO negotiations, especially if it refers to market access in goods. Because the Chinese competitive position is seen as something which will result in loss of market share by most countries which are trying to negotiate opening up each other's markets. The other aspect is that trade is no longer the conventional trade which we think of. Trade today is seen as intimately linked to investment, the global value chains, which Mohan talked about, which results from investment. In fact, Untitled has estimated that 80% of global value chains emanate from FDI from multinational enterprises. To services, together with goods, to technology, transfer technology, which is the future of new products and the new paradigm which is likely to emerge in trade, which links up with e-commerce and digital. China is very much one of the large outward foreign direct investment economies, in addition to being one of the largest recipients of foreign direct investment. Therefore, China's interest in an investment regime which protects its interests is also very high. In fact, when China was the president of G20, one of the key topics it focused on was investment facilitation, something which it is also backing in the WTO context, which India is not with China on that. So the other aspect is that China also is part of the European Union, etc. initiative on e-commerce, something again which India is not comfortable with. So while China is looking to the future and the way the trade system is evolving, India is looking backwards. Another story, I remember after Hong Kong ministerial meeting, the Chinese invited some of the people there, including one of the DDGs of, not me, of WTO to visit China, and he came back and we had a meeting and he said, you know, we can make any walls we want. They have developed and are focusing on new competitive enhancing strategies that they'll jump over it. While we discuss sugar, wheat, cotton, they are in the 21st century. So that's the kind of perspective with which China is engaging with every fora, be it plurilateral, bilateral, or multilateral. So if initiatives in these areas have to go plurilaterally forward, because in WTO you can have a plurilateral, as long as you give MFN, which means whatever market opening obligations you take, you actually make it available to all members. China, more likely than not, will be a part of that. Similarly, there are a number of initiatives which are inside the border initiatives which are now trade policy. China has focused on that immensely. Today, China is at a turning point where it recognizes that its future direction depends very much on how much new technology or high value technology it gets, which means it has started to reform its IPR system. Again, not a place where India and China are in the same group. So, what does this mean? This means that as far as the WTO system is concerned, I don't think it will have results based on consensus. And the other aspect we have to keep in mind is that India today, of course, India has traditionally been a leader of the voice from the developing world. But there are groups today in the WTO like South Africa, LDC groups. South Africa speaks for Africa. which completely have a different position. They just don't want to do anything. So we have a situation in WTO where one part does not want anything to happen. We have something in the middle where India is there. It does want some things in WTO to change. It has identified some areas. And then we have those who want to go into newer areas also. And China is very much part of that. So that's the situation of India vis-a-vis China in the WTO system. Wherever there is conformity of interest, similarity of interest, the two are together. Wherever India doesn't want to be and China wants to be, China is there. And wherever China sees India as a threat in the future, China tries to even change the manner in which agreements are interpreted in the WTO. The example is ITA 2, Information Technology Agreement 2, in which China was a member. And the only reason it's not been concluded is because China said the whole idea when you have a plurilateral and you give MFN to others is that you basically have a critical mass, in the sense those who are outside will not be able to make substantive difference because you have given them market access and they haven't given you anything. And the Chinese basically were of the view that India over time, today is not part of that small group which will become like critical mass, but in the future it will. So they said we have to have a dynamic perspective on what is critical mass. And we have to change the rules of the game when and if such a situation arises. So it's actually seeking changes in the system even where plurilaterals are concerned, taking account of how the markets are going to develop in the future. The other thing which strikes me is that today TPP, which was TPP 12, is TPP 11 in the course of trying to be a final TPP 11. When it happens, if it happens, is anybody's guess. But a lot of TPP was negotiated with an eye towards China. Whether it's state trade, state enterprises, whether it is competition policy, whether it is labor and environmental standards, whether it is preparing to open markets completely over time in these 12 economies, everything was done to prepare a framework of regulations for goods and services in such a way that a more level playing field is created, addressing some of the developments which people in the West see that have arisen to result in a non-level playing field due to China's trade practices. So, interestingly, China is very much on the radar. And more interestingly, China, unlike India, had actually prepared to be part of that system. So, here is a nation on the move, a large nation, which knows that a lot of its prosperity depends on its engagement with the global market. And that market system is going to change precisely because of its large presence. And its practices will become a focus of attention. And therefore, it needs to prepare for the times which are going to come, provided the forces which come against it start generating a different system where its own freedom will be curbed. So, every interaction of China in the WTO will be with that perspective in mind. Because China is a large investor, because China does not want to encourage people to take arbitrary actions against them, and this is where market economy status comes in. The entire spectrum of anti-dumping actions which have been taken, whether they are taken by India or by the US, the largest affected economy is China. And US and India are the two largest users of anti-dumping in a historic sense. India, number one in certain years. And a market economy status means, because under anti-dumping, you normally have to have certain rules of calculating the dumping margin, which is the maximum duty you can levy. Market economy, non-market economy status means that you have the flexibility to do what you want when you're calculating that. And those who are scared of China do not want to lose that. That is the crux of the matter. And that's where now China is testing the dispute settlement system, while US has gone the other way. And it's just a matter of, we have to wait and watch to see how the system actually stays the course in a way in which it can remain strong. But when China is reacting to all these pressures, China is also responsible for one development which is actually with a potential to be the death knell of the WTO formal system. Because China has begun to have informalization of trade policies. I'll give you two examples. When duties were determined on China's solar panels by the European Union, apparently China had been promised by the largest economy in Europe that everything would be done according to the appropriate, correct procedures so that they should not worry, etc. And two countries which had strongly argued for duties, China had got to know which they are, and it began anti-dumping and countervailing duty investigations against important products of those two countries. And for the largest economy in Europe, with reference to that, without naming it, it said it took its most high-value product and said, if things don't improve, we will begin an anti-dumping investigation on that product as well. That's informalization of trade policy. Similarly, recently, when the US put its missiles in South Korea, in a land which belonged to a particular company of South Korea, which had hundreds of its shops in China, China ordered all those shops closed. And it told people that they should stop going as a tourist to South Korea. Again, this is informalization of trade policy. Once this kind of thing happens, which actually is fueled by some of the actions and statements of Mr. Trump as well. Because he believes in raising the stakes through his words and then trying to see what he can achieve, which basically is going beyond a formal system of rules and procedures. If this starts happening, anything which happens at WTO will have a major loophole, especially in the hands of the large economies. And that's something which others who have to use the global trading system for their own growth prospects have to be very careful about. So China, at one end, is trying to take the WTO forward, is very active in that area, but it has begun to behave in a manner which can erode the very foundations of that institution. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Harsh, for making all those very important points. Harsh has a somewhat different take on China's leadership in multilateral trade negotiations. he feels that while China has eschewed the traditional role of coalition building, China has intervened at critical moments with ideas and proposals to take its agenda forward. Harsh makes this very important point which we need to ponder over, that how approach of India and China with regard to multilateral trade negotiations are completely divergent, in the sense that China is looking towards issues of the future, what he calls 21st century issues, while looking backwards. This has led to a situation where scope for coalition building or convergent ground between India and China and a whole lot of issues is getting reduced, even though China does support our position on some issues, as he pointed out, on food stock, for instance. Finally, the point he makes about China's readiness to use its considerable economic clout to advance its interest, for instance, through informalization of trade policy. He gives example of punitive action against ROK in context of latter's deployment of THAAD missiles and how it can impact on WTO regime. Thanks, Harsh, for those points. I'm sure there'll be a lot of discussions. Can I now move on to Bipul for his presentation?
Thank you, Ambassador Kant. Indeed, our pleasure to be associated with India International Center and the Institute of Chinese Studies in organizing this seminar. I think the topic is very seminal in the sense that, as both Ambassador Kumar and Dr. Singh has pointed out, that there are some significant changes which are taking place in the multilateral trading system over the last several years, and China has a very pivotal role to that. On the surface of it, it may sound a very dry subject, but if we scratch it, and as evident from both the previous presentations, I think there is enough spice on it. And sometimes it may be more spicy, which some of our stomach may not fathom. So, therefore, let me try to add to, though it is very difficult, add to what Ambassador Kumar and Dr. Singh have said on this very interesting topic. I am going to speak on three major points. I am going to elaborate on them a little bit. After agreeing to most of what my previous presenters have said, as I said, I agree with what they have said, except perhaps on the last point about the future role or leadership that China may take in taking forward the multilateral trading system in whatever form it may be. Now, before I come to those 3 points, let me also say that there are 2 common factors on each of them. The first is that on each of them there is a popular belief. I would say sort of myths. And the reality is different from those popular beliefs. Therefore, they are contrary to popular belief. And we should look at how China's approach to those issues in order to understand that how China has looked at the multilateral trading system, perhaps trade per se to begin with, and how they have approached and how they are going to approach the system in future. The second common factor is that I have learned most of these things through my interactions, particularly with Dr. Singh, and also with many others who are present here, Ambassador Rana, Ambassador Kant, Professor Wadhwa, Professor Huda, Dr. Seshadri. Therefore, on this occasion of Teachers' Day, let me express my gratitude to all of them for whatever that I could learn while interacting with them and many others. The first thing which I would like to say is that there is a popular belief that WTO agreements have eroded our policy space, the space that we have in taking economic policies. But in my opinion, is that WTO agreements are all about policy space. It's the manner in which you are looking at them. Except perhaps the first 5 or 6 pages, which talks about the principles, the rules of the game. Everything else is about policy space. It is the manner in which you can utilize the space that you have. You can play with the rules that you have. And China is an example of that, in my opinion. Because as both Ambassador Kumar and Dr. Singh, they have said that they have taken much more commitments than other developing countries while acceding to the WTO. Their non-market economy status itself is a huge, I would say, hindrance in taking forward some of their interests in the trading system. So that's one lesson that we should learn. And Dr. Singh has already pointed out that China looks at the system much more positively, or I would say maybe differently, than what we do. The second thing is about, again, it's a popular belief that WTO is all about negotiations and about dispute settlement. But there is a very important third function of the WTO, which is the committee system, how they function, the kind of issues which are discussed in the system, and things like that. The so-called missing middle, as we call them in the multilateral trading system. And if you look at the manner in which China participates in those committee discussions, I follow agriculture quite closely. The kind of questions which China raises, the kind of responses which it gives to questions which are raised on them, it shows the kind of preparedness that they have without making much noise about what they are going to do. Or even while making noise about saying that this is what we are going to do, they may do something differently when it comes to the actual practice. So that is another lesson that we should take while looking at how China has approached the multilateral trading system since their accession, even before their accession. And the third and final thing which I would say is about Doha Round. This is a very popular thing, and the popular belief is that, there are two beliefs. One belief is that the Doha Round is over. I wouldn't use the word dead, because I think the Doha Round was dead in July 2008. This is my personal opinion. And the funeral took place in Nairobi in December 2015 or 2014? 2015. But if we look at the Doha Round agenda, it is clear that more than 80%, in some cases 85 to 90% issues have been resolved. And there are decisions on those issues. Trade facilitation agreement is one of them. There is the agreement on TRIPS and public health. There are a host of issues on which agreements have been reached in order to help least developed countries to get better integrated with the trading system, other than helping them to get more market access for their products. So, and the remaining things which are on which decisions have not been taken, the technical decisions have been taken, but it's about the political decisions, which unfortunately we could not arrive at. On all these cases, we should look at how, and both Dr. Singh and Ambassador Kumar have pointed out, that how China has looked at these issues, how they have behaved in negotiations. There is a popular saying, and I know many of you are aware of it, that it's difficult to get a Chinese negotiator to speak. Perhaps it is much more difficult to get an Indian negotiator to stop speaking. So that is how there is a popular saying in Geneva that China approaches international negotiations on this subject. And there is one more point which I would like to make, is about new issues. We already talked about environmental goods, ITA2, TISA, electronic commerce, investment facilitation. I agree with Ambassador Kumar that China is not yet flexing its muscles as far as the trading system is concerned. But I think there is going to be a significant change which is going to take place in near future. And we are already started seeing some of it, the kind of speech which we heard from President Xi Jinping in Davos last January, the harbingers of globalization, the new form of globalization that China is maybe taking lead, may not be taking lead, that we are not very sure. But the manner in which they are approaching these new issues, at least some of them, and this is significantly linked with their state-owned enterprises and the future of SOEs, whether it is global value chains, whether it is small and medium enterprises, whether it is electronic commerce or investment facilitation, that as Dr. Singh has rightly pointed out, they are following this simple rule that politics has strange bedfellows. They are not averse to go with one particular country or not to go with or go against another country. So whenever they see their interest, they can do whatever they want to do in order to take that interest forward. And that is very evident from the news which we are getting from Geneva over the last several months in respect to electronic commerce, investment facilitation, and such issues. The second important thing which I think, there are two in fact, is that despite all problems which are very much there in the Western media about the Belt and Road initiatives, China is getting its act together on BRI, and this is evident. There are very many examples I can give, but one particular example is that Japan is now also more or less has come around on the BRI. So that is one very important signal which we should take note of, and that is going to maybe a game changer, as it is rightly pointed out that while the software of multilateral trading system is there, these kind of initiatives which are the hardware kind of stuff, but they have implications on global supply chains and things like that. Let me also point it out in this context that the decision which China has taken in joining the TIR convention, which is about the only international convention that we have, UN convention that we have on transport facilitation among countries or between countries. Fortunately, India has also joined, though both by looking at the INSTC, International North-South Trade Corridor, and our interest there, but we also have huge interest on the east, on the eastern side, and TIR convention can, along with BRI, can help us in taking that in those interests forward. The second important point is that after the forthcoming 19th Party Congress, the President Xi Jinping is expected to have much more command over the system there, and perhaps immediately after that, as it's happening, the Buenos Aires Ministerial Conference is happening, we may see somehow a different kind of China in the multilateral trading system. So maybe they will start jumping, not at the height that they may like to, but they may start jumping and showing more muscles in taking forward their interest in the multilateral trading system on specific issues on which they want to make progress. In that context, last 2 points. One is this non-market economy status. I think that's going to be a game changer, and I agree with Dr. Singh on that point, and also with Ambassador Kumar. And we all love to say that whether on paper, in theory, China is a kind of a socialist economy, but in practice, they are much more market-oriented than what we are. And if we love to say that, what stops us in giving the market economy status to China? And that is the position that China is also expected to take at the WTO dispute settlement system. The Second important point which I would like to end with is about this informalization of trade policy, and that is, I think, in my opinion, is much worrisome, and we should start discussing this subject, this kind of issues, maybe outside the WTO, not inside, certainly not inside, but definitely in Geneva and in other major capitals, including Delhi, on how we should approach this kind of stuff in future in order to take forward our own interest in the multilateral trading system. So thank you very much, and I look forward to your
Thank you very much, Dr. Bipul Chatterjee, for your insights. Bipul believes that while China may still be in sort of biding its time mode and not yet flexing its muscles on multilateral trade negotiations, this might be coming to an end, and it might be poised for significant change. And this might happen, according to him, after 19th Party Congress. I think this is a very interesting point he has made, which we can discuss later. Bipul has also, talked about how China has utilized both the policy space available as also various mechanisms and modalities under WTO to advance this agenda. Now, after three very insightful presentations, we have the floor open for discussion. We begin with Master Rana.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I should begin by congratulating ICS, IIC and CUTS for joining hands on a discussion on a theme that is entirely topical and a kind of theme that doesn't get too much attention most of the time in Delhi. I should also congratulate the three speakers for the insights that they've offered in an informal, open manner. And the three talks that have been given have kind of fitted in quite neatly with one another. One by somebody who's a great expert on WTO issues. His doctorate is on WTO issues, in fact, from the great French University. Dr. Singh, who clearly is an insider on WTO issues and knows these intimately from an insider's perspective, and Bipul, of course, who is the great old friend and a great spokesman for a more vigorous Indian standpoint, although he doesn't always say this very openly, and that's part of his discussion. I have two short little questions. The first, how is it that China manages its paradoxical position of being almost the world's largest overseas direct investor? Is that correct? It is today perhaps the world's largest overseas direct investor in terms of current investments, not in terms of past stock, and takes advantage of all the facilities available the world over, and yet maintains at home a system of barriers, formal, informal, quasi-legal, whatever they may be, which inhibit other people from coming and investing in China. And how is it that this issue receives very, very little attention from anyone, be it in WTO, be it elsewhere? I really remain perplexed at this. And my second question is that how is it that here is a country that faces a major challenge in WTO, namely market economy status, which it could be said, it could be assumed was almost promised to it at the end of 15 years, but has not happened, and is not likely to happen also right now, as things are. How is it that China doesn't start jumping up and down on this publicly? Whatever it may do privately in terms of discussions with other countries, etc. I kind of contrast this a little bit, if I may, at the manner in which we tackle this whole issue of gaining membership of the what's the NSG. Nobody has ever explained what benefits will flow to India from NSG membership. But it has become the touchstone of almost everything we want to do. I find this pretty perplexing. Maybe these three gentlemen will have some insights on this. Thank you. But maybe you want to take a few other points and lump it all together. You are the master of the process, sir. Thank you.
Thank you. Very interesting presentations. My first question really is that how important it is for China to become a full-fledged member of WTO. The second is actually more an observation, perhaps the panelists can answer that. That you find Russia also has applied for membership and has been denied membership. Now, very clearly that negotiations for membership are linked up with a lot of bilateral bargaining between countries. And this bargaining is not necessarily confined to trade issues. When we were discussing with the Chinese the accession WTO membership as an emerging market or whatever, what kind of bargaining did we do with them to get things in return from them which actually would have served our interest, either in commercial or trade terms or strategic terms? Thank you.
Thank you, sir. My questions are on the impact of Trump, President Trump, post now globalization to new status of globalization with America first, all of it contradicting and with no great love for WTO as far as I can see in the American president's eyes. And the contradictions that the multinational corporations themselves are now throwing up within USA, which were the beneficiaries, becoming almost irreconcilable with the president's way of thinking. So what implication this has both for United States in the post-globalization world with rising nationalism, and on the WTO's future? That is one part. And the other is that there are contradictory voices from Trump administration on trying to punish China, then withdrawing, then redoing it, calling it both on exchange rate as well as on the dumping part, as well as IPRs, etc., etc. So the frictionful, on net terms, it looks like a frictionful time as far as Trump administration is concerned, as far as US-China trade relations are concerned. What impact this friction will have on the future of the WTO and global trading system, at least in the foreseeable future of 3 to 4 years? Thank you.
I'll begin with Bipul with responses.
Let me try to respond to all these questions, but very, very briefly, because I think the others are really experts on these issues. On your first question, Ambassador Rana, is that, let me give you an example. China has not allowed Facebook and other such things to come to operate in their country, because they understand that theoretically they can produce more than 1 billion clicks a day, and that is the market. And that's why it's nothing to do with any ideology. It's pure business sense which they apply in taking positions. And within the ambit of the existing rules and laws, they will do whatever they would like to do, and they are not afraid of facing disputes, because they are so familiar, as Dr. Singh has already pointed out, in facing particularly anti-dumping related disputes. So they are not very afraid of doing that. And their economy, and they take their measures in a manner that even if you impose 15-20% more tariffs, they don't bother. they can be more competitive even after covering 15-20% tariffs. And let me here quote Professor Danny Rodrick, the manner in which he explained China's globalization, that China has kept its windows open while put mosquito nets on them, so that they get fresh air inside and keeping mosquitoes and other such things from getting into the room. On the second point about market economy status, why there is no public noise, I think they love to do things quietly, and as I said, that they are not much bothered about whether you put 5 to 10% more anti-dumping duties or safeguard duties and things like that. They will do something on their currencies, though for the last 3 years they are actually not manipulating much on their currencies. They take measures. I have visited this Pudong industrial. I'll give you a very briefly, I'll give you this example. I don't know how many scientists in India as a whole, they are working on sanitary and phytosanitary measures. 10 years back I visited that Pudong industrial state. There are 1,500 scientists they are working round the clock, 24 hours, just on sanitary and phytosanitary, just in one industrial estate in China. That kind of domestic capacity building that they have done, and this point was underlined in the previous presentations, the kind of domestic capacity building that they have done. What was the importance for China to become a WTO member? To become more prosperous. And the simple answer is to become more prosperous. If we look at the per capita income in China, the year 2000-2002 is the king point. If I compare that with India and other such developing countries, there is a huge jump since 2000-2002, and that's perhaps is the most important motivation. And if I go back to the manifesto of the Chinese Communist Party, the first line says that we want to regain our position which we used to have in 14th, 15th century. So they always keep that in mind. Their leadership and everybody down the leader, they always keep that in mind. And I'm very sad to say this, but let me also give you a figure. This is what calculation which I have done, that at the present level, if I compare the per capita income of India and China, in order for us to catch up with China, we have to grow at 10 to 10.5% a year on an average for the next 30 years. I don't know, let me pose a question whether it is possible for us to do that over the next 30 years or not. If we can't do that, then in 2050, maybe some questions may be posed on our system. Maybe our next generation, they are going to pose some questions on our system. I know that Mr. Rana may have different position on that. Bargaining chips with China, I mean, we have to look at that. How is it possible for Malaysia to access Chinese market on product X, whereas we are unable to access Chinese market on product X? We have to do sector-specific, product-specific analysis and see how other. It's not that, and this again, it's a myth. The reality is that China is a huge importer, and our share of Chinese import is less than 1%, 0.006% to be precise. So how it is possible for South Korea to access certain products in the Chinese market, for Malaysia, for Indonesia, and why we are unable to do it? Is it just because we are not competitive, or is there any other reason? So we have to do such very specific studies, analysis, and make practical recommendations other than just making PowerPoint presentations. On the last point about the impact of Trump on MPS, I think there is not going to be much impact. This is my personal opinion. Because he will keep saying certain things, keep tweeting, but how much attention that the actual players, those who are on the ground in the US system itself, how much attention that they are giving, I don't know. I don't think they are giving much of attention. The only example I would give you vis-a-vis China is that he started saying currency manipulator, etc., during the campaign time. But in January this year, 35 trademark licenses were issued by China. and 33 of them were related to in some business or the other of Mr. Trump and his family. So China knows how to handle that.
China knows very good.
Thank you very much. Ambassador Rana's first question, how does China manage being largest investor abroad and has several constraints at home? Actually, China has constraints at home, and they are unusual constraints, but not unusual in large part compared to what a lot of countries actually impose. China goes further than that in terms of transfer technology, etc., in order to acquire technology. But it's a huge market, and wherever it allows foreign direct investment, it provides a lot of facilities there. In fact, I was in the Tianjin economic zone, and they basically, this was 2014, by that time, out of the Fortune 500 global companies, 214 of them had already promised that they are going to come there. It's a huge, huge attraction for them to be there. It's a very large market which is growing very significantly, and even if it's 6%, if it's 5 times our size, that 6% is equal to 30% of our annual growth. I mean, that's the absolute increase in the market which they are producing. So it's very attractive. People go there for that reason. There was a very interesting piece of news that right now there is a US company which is actually helping China with technology upgradations and acquisition of capacity so that it can actually outcompete the US. So it's capitalism at its crudest. And therefore, that's the inward. Now outwards, it's very interesting what China actually does. I haven't looked at outward foreign direct investment in China for some years, but when I did, 2 things struck me. A huge portion of it went to Hong Kong, and then it went to various parts of the world. And so much noise is made of investment to Africa. When I looked at it, only 4% of outward foreign direct investment of China went to Africa. Most of it is in other parts, buying companies with a strategic kind of importance. They always have strategy underlying that. And then, in order to really build the base for their foreign direct investment, they have done at least the following. They entered into BIT negotiations with US and EU, so that they have bilateral investment treaty negotiation. In the negotiations with EU, they actually have a side agreement on labor standards. This is China agreeing to aspects relating to labor standards with the European Union. They have gone way beyond what other developing countries, including countries like Australia, etc., developed economies, think on BIT, ISDS, etc., in their negotiations with the US. It's all to ensure that conditions are created that their investment actually gets the protection which a legal regime can provide. In addition to that, they basically have been pushing for some kind of a move on investment and on against some of the conditions which are imposed whenever their investment is actually refused on grounds of security, etc. So they engage and they promise things in return. They have the capacity to do that. So it's a combination of factors, but these are the different factors which affect the kind of balance which you talked about. Why is China not jumping up and down publicly? Because China knows it won't matter. What matters is how they get the system around to what they are trying to do. And they are very focused on that. And they are very focused on that in multiple ways. And they make political statements, they make coalition building efforts, and they actually use the system, the kind of thing which Bipul was saying. They use the system in many ways. So they, as I said, they were actually firing the bullets from our shoulder. And the manner in which they interact in meetings is very different from the manner in which some of the other developing countries interact. Because they actually feel that they are amongst the top two, if not the leading economy in the world, if they have a medium-term perspective. So they behave like one, which is actually with that clout. How important is it for China to become full-fledged member? China is a full-fledged member.
No, I mean, this is, it wants to remove the emergency economy status. Yeah.
The market economy.
Yeah, market.
Yeah, it's important, but with that status, it has done whatever it has done. So what it will do is, there's also a limit to how many anti-dumping measures you can have. You can, one would think that is not the case. But interestingly, when fishery subsidies, solutions were emerging in WTO, China came out with a proposal linking it to anti-dumping discipline. So it will keep raising this issue and keep pressurizing people. At the same time, sometimes the companies themselves are against the anti-dumping because it is the country which is imposing that is the country which is actually investing in China and exporting it back. And in a world of global value chains, to think of different points of the chain when you are actually imposing an anti-dumping duty, you might actually be hurting yourself. All this will become clear as more and more time evolves. So basically, it does not want to be affected that way, but it's not something which is such a binding constraint that is suffocating. Russia is a member. Russia is a full member. Yeah. Now, what kind of bargaining did we do? I think I'll leave that to Mohan. I had a premise on that. Mohan has confirmed it, so it better come from him. Because you'll be surprised.
Okay.
Then, impact of Trump, no great love for WTO, contradictions within, what implications for WTO? One of the implications for WTO of any large member taking a position which is difficult for others to agree with is that you don't have a multilateral agreement. There was a time when large members could come up with an understanding, say the US initially, then US, EU, and the others could be made to agree by saying, okay, we won't give you this much obligation. Let's see, what else do you need in this system? So that the system comes into place. Today, that's no longer the situation. There's no hegemony. Today, you have the power to block. You don't have the power to actually get agreement. Any large member which doesn't agree and sticks to its guns can prevent a multilateral agreement in WTO. And that's the way WTO system today has become. So in that context, then the issue will be, should we have some kind of a plurilateral? What is the interest which US might have in this? And the US is waiting for its policy paper which will come out next month. In fact, every initiative will then be linked or based upon this policy paper. But the final answer to your question depends on, does the US feel that WTO is an incremental stepwise process to whatever it develops outside the WTO? Or does it want in a big leap to reach wherever it wants to reach at one go? If I have to bet, and I'm not a betting man, but if you force me to say, no, you give me your perspective, I would bet on the first. Because US has to see this as a stepwise function. Because except for ITA, which was agreed in Singapore ministerial meeting, every advance has been preceded by something outside the WTO, be it a change in US law, change in EU policy, or an FTA. So that's the way I think if people can convince the administration and the USTR, whatever noises he may make, and the others involved, including Commerce Secretary, they actually in personal engagement are far more reasonable than how they come across to the press. So I think WTO definitely is not in for a time of multilateral agreements, but depending on how US sees this as a process of going forward, and that's where it will also depend on how much it sticks to the changes it is seeking in the appellate body system, the dispute settlement.
So Ashok, in the interest of time, I think I'll not repeat the excellent points made by my co-panelists. Ambassador Rana, I think you've received the answer, but whenever I have posed this question to French investors, and since I was very recently there was a unanimous view that it is far easier to enter the Chinese market than the Indian market. I think one should be very clear about that. The only other thing I heard about them was that it is, of course, very easy to enter the Chinese market. It's very difficult to get out. That I have heard. The other thing I've heard about the Indian situation is that in India, in the end, it always works out. But then you also have to adopt the view that if it doesn't work out, it's still not the end. So you keep on going. I mean, that is that philosophical thing about. So I don't think that's a way. But as far as why China is not jumping up and down, it could also be the press, actually. Their political system is very different. I mean, here, you announce something and then the opposition party is taking the government to the cleaners. That doesn't happen there. And in fact, if I'm asked to interpret the Doklam situation, I think it's pretty bad the way the press was vituperative in China. And then now, all of a sudden, they are talking about good relations. It doesn't make any sense to me. But anyway, I leave that to China experts. Ambassador, and since Harsh, my good friend, has put me on the spot bargaining with China, very truthfully, and since I'm now honorably retired, I feel very liberated and free and frank and the rest of it. But I do speak under correction. My senior colleague, Ambassador Haran, is here. He was actually the DPR, and I'm most happy to be corrected by him. My sense is that we never approached it with a view to getting something out of it. I genuinely, this was not stated in any of the Commerce Ministry position papers. But it was a bit like Nehru wanting China to sit in the UN Security Council. I somehow felt when I talked to my seniors that we wanted China to be part of the WTO. Why? Don't ask me. We felt somehow that sorry?
MEA had no role to play in this?
No. MEA would enter the picture if there are very serious foreign policy implications. And if there was any input, I am not aware of it. The only thing could have been that the MEA might have also said that, listen, we have enough battles with them. This is not another front that we want open. But there is also one pragmatic reason, I think, why we did not engage with China at that stage. We were actually under severe pressure in the Doha round. We had already been part of the Seattle, where it was actually, we didn't show our glee, but we were not too unhappy with what happened in Seattle. So there were, I think, far greater issues at stake. And I think you also have to be honest enough to admit that it was the year of the Lord 2001, when India was, I think, significantly weaker economically vis-a-vis China compared to 2017. Today you can talk in slightly different terms, although I still think the asymmetry is pretty big. But today you can talk of some, for example, if you asked me what we could have done, forget about the tariffs and the rest of it, I would say the barriers in the services area, which is now hurting us very badly. I would have, if you had given me the carte blanche, I could have done something there and got something out of them, at least for Indian companies. Not sure it could have worked, but it was worth a try. But other than that, I wouldn't add anything on that. Can Trump wreck the WTO? the fond hope among those of us who love the WTO is that he would wreck himself before he does that. But then that's neither here nor there. I think the WTO should be ideally compared with a traffic light. You take it for granted, but then if you don't have the traffic lights working, then you end up with multiple collisions. I think that is the best description of WTO I have heard. And I think it's very true, which is why I'm worried not so much about what China and others are doing. I'm extremely worried, as also a person who has done multiple panels in the WTO. I am extremely concerned about the dispute settlement mechanism in the WTO and the pressure it is facing. That is of such vital significance to the objectives of the multilateral trading system of being secure, security, predictability, open, non-discriminatory. Everything will come crashing down if the dispute settlement mechanism, with all its flaws, and you can pick holes in it, but it's still the best system we have in the world of conflict resolution. So that worries the hell out of me. And finally, Dr. Bipul Chatterjee's question about how we can cope with China. I think the question is a false one, Dr. Chatterjee, if you allow me. The question is not whether India will ever be like China or whatever. I think if some of you haven't read Kofi Annan's report on SDGs, you should. He very dramatically says there are only two regions of the world which have extreme abject poverty. One is sub-Saharan Africa, should come as no surprise. The other is South Asia, but read India. So that is what should be India's goal. Not even trying to match China. Why should we? I think we are who we are. We are sui generis. So I think the problem for us is really of a much, much different scale. He pretty much concludes in that report that there is no extreme poverty in China. So there is no comparison really. Thank you, Ashok.
Thank you. We are in fact running out of time. So what I'll do, go through one more round of questions, but request all of you to pose very pointed questions, and to specific panelists who will be requested to give very pointed replies also. I start with Seshadri.
Mine will not be questions. It will be two observations, but observations in the form of comments on what has been mentioned. The WTO rules are largely meant for free market economies. And to an extent, it requires some transparency, some openness, and I would also say local justiciability. I was also one of the admirers of China when they initially took those onerous commitments. Incidentally, I was heading the delegation which went to China to sign the accession agreement. And the kind of commitments that they took, and how they overcame through this intense export effort. But equally, I get this feeling that the implementation of WTO commitments by China has been of a very political character, depending on which country they deals with. And it basically imports what it needs. But if there is a competitor for a domestic product, and there are issues, then the WTO finds ways to not allow them. Ambassador Mohan Kumar mentioned the French ambassador found that the Chinese market was easier than the Indian market. But maybe the products we are looking at is different. But there is also the political factor in term concern to deal with it, etc. And I'm not just referring to China here. The Japanese market and the Korean markets are very difficult. And I have tried to study the implementation of our FTA agreements with these two countries. And the kind of answers that you get when we seek access for our pharmaceutical products, if they are accepted by the US market, yes, there are some issues, there are FDA recalls from time to time, etc. But if you look at the numbers, they are very substantial part of our exports. But if you look at the pharmaceutical percentage of exports of India to either Korea or China, they are minuscule. Despite a zero duty access. Now, why is that so? Engineering products, again the same set of issues, and of course agricultural product is almost out of question. For the FTA negotiation, for the FTA implementation in Japan, I went to Japanese Ministry of Agriculture seeking a meeting for why we don't get access for a few products. They said the concerned person is not there after the meeting is arranged. So they find ways to avoid you trying to get access. And in the case of China, even engineering products, you require those people to come to your units to check everything is all right, get the go-ahead, and then you are able to export after the necessary checks. And the point I'm trying to make is that they have successfully found a way, including through language, because they require documentation in the Chinese language, fair enough, but make it onerous. This is an issue which will affect us. We do not have the clout of developed countries to be able to take these up regularly, every 3 months, every 2 months, etc. So I would put the, we really have to put in a lot more effort, but I would not give a very right for Chinese implementation. And therefore, whatever we are doing on anti-dumping, I think it's perfectly right. Now I'm coming to the second question, really, this is important. Is there any study on non-market economy? What is Chinese economy? Is it a non-market economy or a market economy? Has there been any rigorous study on it, particularly from the viewpoint of access of a developing country to the Chinese market? I think it will be extremely useful because there are no studies. On what basis do we rule that this economy is a market economy?
Very good. Excellent. Please keep your question very brief.
Thank you, sir.
And your question, who would you like to answer?
All of us. Anyone. All of
You are designated.
My first query is, can be shared between Dr. Mohan or Dr. Harsha. You shared that when FDI flows into China, they have the benefits of extremely easy entry and facilitation, which is incomparably better than India. In addition to that, we also have read many literature, like the one by Tony Rodriguez, that the effects were spilling to the Chinese economy and in terms of skill development and other managerial practices. So did China place any performance requirements on its FDI-oriented companies? Is performance requirement, is it permitted under the TRIMS agreement? Is tax holiday a performance requirement? So this is my first query. And the second one is more of an observation thing which is related to Dr. Chatterjee's statement when he referred to SPS, sanitary and phytosanitary measures. I wonder, why is India lagging in initiatives in this regard? Why are we lagging in research on SPS measures? This is an area which can easily be covered under green box subsidies, which is well permitted and least disputed. Rather, this can be allowed. So this is my query. Thank you.
Very brief question. That what I wanted to say has been covered mostly by Dr. Siddharthi. My question is to Dr. Bipul Chatterjee. When you spoke, you seem to suggest that if Indian companies are not able to use the Chinese market or penetrate the Chinese market, there is something that they are not doing properly, while the other countries are able to do so. Now, for example, in the case of agricultural commodities, pharmaceuticals, engineering, where do they lack? I mean, if there are specific examples as to what they should be doing to get access in the market.
Thank you. My name is Ravi Bhuthalingam. My background is the corporate world, and I'm also a fellow with the Institute of Chinese Studies. First of all, thank you, panelists, for an excellent set of presentations. My question is on the intellectual property regime of China, be it as it may. For many years, China had the reputation, and still has largely, of being an intellectual property stealer, pirate, call it what you will. But over the past several years, there has been a change in terms of moving up the value chain into more sophisticated types of production. So I would like to hear from you, what in your view is going to be the evolution of the IP regime in China? Is it going to follow the IP regime that the West has very largely sought to bring about, and the United States probably an IP regime of its own in addition to what is being accepted? Or is it going to be an IP regime which will be with Chinese characteristics? If so, what is it going to be? Thank you.
Very brief.
So one trade agreement that China is really pushing for these days is RCEP. How should India approach this?
Very brief. One line question.
Also, just my question could be answered by either Ambassador Mohan or Dr. Edvi Singh. First thing is the state-owned enterprises which exist in China. I mean, so despite everything, they still go on, and you sir mentioned about it also. How is it they are pulling on? One is this. Secondly, second question. So simple. It's simple. Gordon Chang keeps saying that there's a 288% deficit which China has. And despite all that, they are going on with over investments. How are they managing their economy? And I just got just now the thing that the Chinese banks are going to bust any time. I just want to.
Okay, we'll have Harsha and Mohan and Bipul. I'll request panelists to keep their answers rather brief because we have to finish latest by 5 p.m.
There are studies of, I haven't looked very recently, but there are studies, especially in the European Union and US, etc., on non-market economy characteristics, especially of China. And also when anti-dumping actions are taken, either you presume that or you actually then also in your investigations take account of the difference between a market economy and a non-market economy, and you highlight that. It depends on the investigating authority. So but there are studies. And given the fact that OECD, European Union, US, etc. have coined the term competitive neutrality, which is precisely to address the ways in which the Chinese government and others with sovereign funds, etc., affect the competitiveness of state enterprises, seems to suggest that there is an issue of non-market systems. Did China place performance? China is a classic performance requirement regime for foreign direct investment. It started actually with Korea first, and the whole purpose was to acquire technology and improve capabilities. The WTO does not necessarily have provisions against performance requirement per se, unless they are seen as some kind of restrictions or some kind of a subsidy provided or linked to trade per se. That's why the TRIMS agreement is actually a trade-related investment measures agreement. It's only a reiteration of the two provisions of GATT system, where they make sure that you don't place quantitative restraints on trade, and you don't actually link it to exports, etc., or don't give foreign exchange linked to export. And there's an illustrative list. Tax holiday can be a performance requirement if it gets linked in this manner. Otherwise, it need not. Tax holiday can be just like a domestic subsidy, which is used all over. Then on IPR, what will be the evolution of the IP regime in China? I mentioned about the fact that the Chinese are very keen on getting high value technology, state of the trade kind of technologies. And that they are fully aware they will not get without a state-of-the-art IPR. Therefore, in their free trade zones, they actually have put in place, or they had plans to put in place in 2014, state-of-the-art IPR. How this will evolve over time, how IPR policies will be supplemented with competition policy or some other kind of activities is something which one waits to see. But the important point is that while all this is happening, the Chinese economic performance is also linked to the opportunities which others have or provide to China or have for China. And over time, it's expected that China will become far more important, but that will also mean greater reliance on other economies. How that plays out depends on how coalitions are built outside. So there are many scenarios, and one of them could be that it evolves ultimately with Chinese characteristics.
Thank you, Harsh. Mohan?
Very briefly, I completely agree with what Harsh said, so I will not cover the same ground. State-owned enterprises, there's one practical reason and there is one philosophical reason, I think. I think one of the issues is that the Chinese have come up with a system which can best be described as state capitalism. And WTO isn't prepared, isn't geared for that. It's very unique. The second practical reason is that there is no rule against state-owned enterprises in the WTO legal system. The government procurement thing is actually plurilateral. You can join it if you like. And we don't have competition policy which is been included in the regime of the hardcore regime of the WTO. So I think those should give you enough of an answer as to why they're able to get away with it, if that is what your question is. IPRs, just to support what Harsh said, I really, if you look at the number of patents that has been filed, I can actually see China playing the game. So I don't think you're going to see any Chinese characteristics. The Chinese way of doing it is you violate as much as you can, as much as the WTO will allow. And you exploit the system as much as you can, as much as you allow. So it's very clear. They will do both. And that is not contradictory at all from their point of view. Thank you.
Thank you. On your question, sir, about why Indian companies are unable to penetrate the Chinese market, I mean, there are many reasons. I mean, very briefly, actually this question requires a whole seminar to get even a partial answer to that question. But there could be many reasons, but one possible reason, in my opinion, is that we are unable to understand the kind of standards of the products that they want, particularly on the high-value products. And the second possible reason could be that, and I have no apology in saying that I'm yet to come across a good study on this question. Why our companies, good study in the sense, farm-level study, are unable to penetrate the Chinese market. Perhaps most of us are not interested. Still we consider trade as a residual activity. Still we are in 1950s, the Lamin theory of surplus theory of trade. That surplus theory of trade, that whatever we are producing for the domestic market, whatever is surplus, we tend to export that product. So that could be another possibility, that we are simply not interested in it. Not pharmaceuticals. I'm not talking about pharmaceuticals per se. I mean in general, that we are not considering trade as an activity in itself, rather than considering it as a residual kind of activity. On your point about SPS, green box subsidies, frankly speaking, I haven't understood this question clearly. One part is, I don't know how some of those measures can be considered under green box or even Article 6.2 of AOA exemptions of such subsidies kind of stuff. But one thing which is very clear is that we are yet to, even after becoming a member of the WTO in 1995, before that we were a founder member of GATT, we are yet to get our system in order. And that is an unfortunate and sad story. On the last point about China's and RCEP, I think China takes RCEP very, very seriously, and that's why they want to walk that extra mile, and others, I mean, at the moment, my understanding is both China and Japan, they are working together and they have put their gun on Philippines, on the shoulder of Philippines and other such countries to get RCEP concluded as soon as possible. One way of looking at how things are going to unfold in future is to look at how China particularly, and of course the United States, how they are behaving at APEC. Many of the things which we are discussing, many of those things have actually came up in APEC in mid-90s, in early 90s, in late 90s. So that is one way of looking at how things are going to unfold in the next 20, 25, 30 years. Okay? And I think once the RCEP is concluded, China may not take much time to start making noise on FATF, Free Trade Area for Asia and Pacific. Particularly because TPP-11, I don't know whether it's going to happen or not, may happen, may not happen, may not have that kind of oomph which TPP-12 could have had. Therefore, I think China is looking at RCEP from that angle. And my final point, and there is no question on that, I will leave this as a question to this very erudite audience, is, I mean, drawing from Arrow's impossibility theorem, that you cannot have three choices at a time. About 10 years back, Danny Rodrik wrote a very seminal paper, I would say, where he talked about the conditions on which you cannot have, you can make a choice between the two of the three, which are democracy, globalization, and sovereignty. You cannot have choice of all three at a time. So that's a question I would like to leave with.
Thank you, Bipul. It's very appropriate that we are finishing with a question. Because as you get better educated, you have more questions to ask. It has been, I'm sure you'll agree with me, a most educative session. We need, in fact, follow-up discussion on many of the issues that have been raised. In the meantime, what we'll do, we'll put up on YouTube a recording of this discussion. So please join me in giving a big round of applause to the three